The desperate situation. In the cold, dark corner of an alien prison, a human prisoner sat slumped against the rough stone wall. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, and his body bore the marks of many days, no, many weeks, of torment. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, sharp and steady, sending a shiver down his spine. He knew what was coming. He had known for hours, maybe even days, but it still made his heart race. The door to his cell creaked open, revealing two tall, dark figures, alien guards. Their skin was a sickly green, their eyes glowing with an unsettling yellow hue. The prisoner didn't move. He didn't look at them. He had learned long ago that showing fear would make it worse. The guards exchanged a glance before stepping forward, dragging their prisoner to his feet roughly. "Another round of pain, human," one of the guards said, his voice cold and harsh. The prisoner could hear the mocking tone in his words, as though he were speaking to an insect. The prisoner tried to steady his breath. He was tired, so tired. His limbs were sore, and his body screamed for rest. But he had to stay strong. He had to survive. As the guards led him down the dark corridor, he could hear the sounds of other prisoners, their desperate whispers and weak cries, but none of them had the strength to resist. None of them had the fire in their hearts like he did. The human had been in this alien prison for what seemed like forever. When he first arrived, he had fought back. With every ounce of strength he had resisted, knowing he could never allow himself to be broken. But now, after endless days of pain, his body was failing him. The aliens were clever. They knew how to break a human spirit. They knew how to wear them down, little by little. Yet, through all the pain, something inside him refused to die. Every night, when the lights went out and the guards left to rest, he would think of home. He would remember the beautiful skies of Earth, the people he loved, and the freedom he once knew. And in those moments, the fire inside him burned brighter than ever. Today was no different. Today, he would face the aliens' torture again, but something deep within him told him that it might be the last time. Maybe today, the aliens would make a mistake. Maybe today, he would get a chance to fight back. They reached the torture chamber. The prisoner's heart pounded in his chest as they shoved him into the cold, metallic chair. The room was sterile and harsh, with strange, unidentifiable machines lining the walls. His eyes darted around, but he saw no way out. He had been here countless times before, and each time he thought, "This will be the last." The guard strapped him into the chair, tightening the restraints. His arms and legs were locked in place, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. The alien leader, tall, thin, and with a cruel smile, entered the room. His name was Targath, and he had a reputation for being merciless. "Well, well," Sargoth sneered, walking slowly towards the prisoner. "You are a tough one. Too bad it won't matter. No one can withstand what's coming." The prisoner looked up at the alien, his eyes filled with defiance. "I won't break," he thought to himself. "Not today." Sargoth studied the human for a moment, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Why do you resist so much, human?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. "We've broken so many of your kind before. Why do you keep fighting?" The prisoner didn't respond. He knew that words wouldn't help him. He had learned that silence was often the best answer. The alien leaned in closer, his breath foul, in the human's face. The prisoner kept his gaze steady, refusing to show fear. "Is it because you believe there is hope?" Sargoth asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you think your people will come for you? That someone will come and rescue you from this? You are a fool." The human didn't flinch. He knew there was no rescue coming. His team had been captured days ago, and no one was coming to save him. But that didn't matter. "I don't need anyone else," he thought. "I have myself, and I will never give up." Sargoth stepped back, motioning to his guards. One of them flipped a switch on a nearby machine. It hummed to life, a low growl filling the room. The prisoner tensed, knowing what was coming. The alien leader smiled cruelly as he gave the signal. The machine powered up, sending waves of intense heat through the prisoner's body. His muscles screamed in protest, and pain surged through him like fire. But he clenched his teeth, refusing to give the aliens the satisfaction of hearing him scream. The guards watched eagerly, hoping for a reaction, but the prisoner stayed silent. Sargoth's smile faltered. He didn't understand. Why isn't he screaming? Why isn't he begging for mercy? The prisoner's mind drifted, the pain becoming almost a distant sensation. He thought of his family, his friends, and the life he had once known. He thought of Earth, its beauty, its promise. And in those thoughts, he found strength. The aliens could hurt his body, but they couldn't take away his spirit. As the heat increased, the prisoner's resolve only grew stronger. The aliens had underestimated him. They thought they could break him, but they were wrong. Deep inside, a small spark of hope burned bright. He was human, and humans were resilient. And so, as the torture continued, the prisoner stayed silent. But in his heart, he knew that this wouldn't be the end. No matter how much they tried, no matter how many times they hurt him, he would keep fighting, because he knew that as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would never stop. And that was something the aliens would never understand. The human's silent strength. The cold, sterile walls of the alien prison seemed to close in around the human as he sat in his cell. His body ached with every breath, but his mind was sharp, far sharper than the aliens ever gave him credit for. The pain had become a constant companion, yet it no longer controlled him. It had tried to break him in every way possible, using every form of torture they could invent, but he had learned to endure it. The aliens had underestimated him from the beginning. They believed that humans, with their fragile bodies, were easy prey. But the human knew something they didn't. Humanity's true strength wasn't in its muscles, but in its willpower. He had seen it in his fellow soldiers, in his family, and in every person who had ever fought against impossible odds. They could hurt him. They could bruise him, but they could never take his spirit. In his early days as a prisoner, when his body was still strong, the human had resisted with all his might. But now his strength was gone. His arms felt like lead, and his legs barely held him up. His once sharp eyes were now heavy with exhaustion, and yet the light of defiance remained in them, refusing to fade. It was that defiance that kept him going, that kept his heart beating, even as his body seemed to give up. Each day felt like a repetition of the last. The alien captors would drag him from his cell, shackled and battered, and take him to the torture chamber. They had tried everything: heat, cold, electricity, starvation, and isolation. They had tried to break him with their mind games and cruel tricks. But each time, the human refused to break. He endured. He kept his silence, his face a mask of calm, even when the pain became unbearable. The aliens didn't understand. They thought his silence was weakness, but it was his greatest strength. The prisoner knew that if he gave them the satisfaction of hearing him scream, they would win. He couldn't let them have that victory. He couldn't show them that they had the power to break him. His silence was the last weapon he had, and he wielded it like a sword. At night, when the lights went out and the aliens retreated to their quarters, the human would sit in the dark and remember. He would think of Earth, of the world he had left behind, of the people he loved. He thought of his family, his friends, the simple joys of life that had once seemed so insignificant. He remembered the beauty of the forests, the vast oceans, and the sun setting over the horizon. And in those memories, he found strength. But there was something more, something deeper, something the aliens could never take from him. He remembered the words of his mother, spoken to him when he was just a child. Never give up, no matter how hard it gets. The true strength of a person isn't in how much they can take, but in how much they can overcome. Those words had stuck with him throughout his life. And now, in this alien prison, they became his mantra. Each time the pain threatened to break him, He would repeat those words in his mind. They were a reminder that he wasn't just a prisoner. He was more than that. He was human, and humans were built to survive, to fight, and to overcome. On some days, he would catch a glimpse of the other prisoners, humans and aliens alike, locked in their own cells. Some of them had given up completely. They sat in silence, their eyes empty, their bodies broken. But the human never joined them. He refused to let himself become like them. As long as he had breath in his lungs, he would keep fighting. He would keep his head high, even in the darkest moments. One night, after a particularly brutal session in the torture chamber, the human found himself sitting in his cell, his body bruised and battered, but his mind clearer than ever. The pain was excruciating, but it had not broken him. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose. There was something he hadn't realized before. The aliens had their ways of hurting him, but they also had their weaknesses. They had grown confident, careless even. They had become so focused on breaking him. They hadn't noticed the small details. The guards were always the same, never changing shifts. The walls had cracks in them, some even large enough to crawl through if he was ever given the chance. And most importantly, the aliens had underestimated his resilience. They had no idea what he was capable of. The prisoner had been waiting. He had been waiting for the right moment, for the perfect chance to strike. And that moment was coming. He didn't know when it would happen or how, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to die in this prison. He would escape. He would fight back. He would make them regret the day they ever captured a human. As he sat in the darkness, his body aching, but his spirit burning brighter than ever, the prisoner made a vow to himself. He would never give up. He would never let the aliens win. Because as long as he had the will to fight, they could never defeat him. In that moment, he realized that his true strength didn't lie in his ability to endure the pain. It lay in his refusal to surrender. And with that realization, a new fire lit within him. The human was no longer just surviving. He was ready to fight, ready to take back control. The aliens might have thought they could break him, but they had only awakened a force they could never understand. The human had become something more than a prisoner. He had become a symbol of defiance, and that symbol would not be extinguished, no matter what they did. The battle for his freedom had only just begun. The first torture attempt. The cold metallic floor of the alien prison seemed to absorb every step, every movement. The sound of boots clanking against the surface echoed down the long, sterile corridor as the human prisoner was dragged once more from his cell. He didn't resist. He couldn't. His body, though filled with fire and determination, was physically exhausted. Yet inside, his spirit was anything but broken. He had endured worse. He had seen the darkness before and emerged from it. And as he was pulled toward the chamber of horrors, he held on to the one thing the aliens could never take from him, his mind. The room ahead loomed like a death trap, its walls lined with complex alien devices, humming ominously. Some of them were meant to induce pain, extreme, unbearable pain, and others were designed to break the mind. The human had already been through them all, and while his body was slowly weakening, his mind remained unscathed. He had learned to focus on the smallest things, his breath, the heartbeat in his chest, the small flicker of hope that lingered in his heart. The aliens didn't understand. They believed their technology could control everything, that they could bend any creature to their will with a few buttons or switches. But they had forgotten the most important thing, the human spirit. As the doors to the chamber slid open, the human felt his body tense. He knew what awaited him on the other side. Another round of pain. Another trial of endurance. The torture would begin again. 2 alien guards stood beside a large, ominous machine. It was unlike anything the human had ever seen. The device looked like a mixture of twisted metal and glowing, pulsing energy. Several needles extended from it, and strange tubes filled with an unknown liquid hung from various parts of the machine. The alien leader, Sargoth, stood at the far end, his eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. "Time for something new," Sargoth sneered. "We've been far too lenient with you, human. Now we will see how much your body can truly endure." The human didn't respond. He had learned long ago that words were useless. If he spoke, he would give them a reason to continue. Silence was his weapon. The aliens hated it, and the more they tried to provoke him, the stronger he became in his silence. The guards pulled him toward the machine and strapped him into place. The cold metal of the chair bit into his skin as they tightened the restraints. His hands and feet were bound, rendering him helpless. His only option was to face whatever the aliens had in store for him. But deep inside, a small spark of defiance remained, even as the machines powered up. Sargoth walked forward slowly, studying the human. "I'm curious," he mused, tapping his sharp fingers against the machine. "How long can you last this time? Will you finally break?" The human clenched his jaw, refusing to show any sign of weakness. The machine hummed to life, and a series of needles extended toward his arms. He steeled himself, his body tensing as the first needle pierced his skin. It was sharp, cold, and instantly painful, but he didn't scream. He refused to. The pain increased as more needles injected strange fluids into his veins. His muscles spasmed involuntarily, but he held his ground. The pain was intense, unlike anything he had felt before. The aliens had mastered the art of physical torture, but they didn't know how to break the human's mind. And that was where their mistake lay. As the liquid continued to course through his veins, his body began to burn with heat. Sweat poured from his forehead, his heart pounding in his chest. But the human did not scream. He did not beg. He simply closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, as he had done so many times before. "Look at you," Sargoth laughed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're nothing. You're weak, and yet you refuse to break. It's almost impressive." But the human didn't care for the alien's words. They meant nothing. The pain was just another obstacle, another challenge he had to overcome. The real battle was within him. It always had been. The machine twisted, and another set of needles entered his legs. The human's muscles burned as they were injected with more of the alien substance, the pain growing exponentially with each passing second. His vision blurred, but he refused to give in. His mind was his fortress, and as long as he held on to that, he could withstand anything. Sargoth leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "I wonder, human, how much more you can take? Do you feel the limits of your body now? The agony that courses through your veins? Your body is breaking, and soon your mind will follow." The prisoner's body trembled with the intensity of the pain, but his mind remained sharp. He could feel his pulse racing, his chest tightening with each breath. But through it all, a single thought echoed in his mind: "I will not give in." The alien guards watched with growing frustration as the human showed no sign of breaking. They were used to seeing prisoners plead for mercy, to beg for an end to the torment. But not this human. This one refused to show weakness. It was maddening. And yet, the guards were beginning to wonder just how far this one could go. Sargoth stepped back, his frustration mounting. "No matter how many times we do this, you will never learn. You will never break." His voice was full of disdain, but there was an underlying sense of doubt creeping into his tone. The human's body was shaking uncontrollably now, and his vision was clouded by pain. But inside, he was calm. The machine might tear at his body, but his mind was still intact. As long as he could hold on to that, he could keep fighting. And then, just when the pain seemed to reach its peak, something unexpected happened. The machine suddenly stopped. The room went silent. The alien guards looked at one another in confusion, while Sargoth's eyes narrowed in suspicion. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The human didn't know why the machine had stopped. But he didn't care. He had endured. He had held on. And in that moment of silence, something shifted. The human spirit, untouched by the torment, seemed to grow stronger. The aliens may have thought they could break him, but they had underestimated what a human could truly endure. And as the tension in the room hung thick, the human knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. A glimpse of hope. The alien torture chamber had grown familiar over the weeks, though no part of it was ever easy to endure. The cold, sterile walls, the humming machines, and the steady, mocking presence of Targuth, the alien leader, felt like an ever-present weight, pressing down on the human prisoner's mind. Yet today, something was different. Something had changed, though the prisoner himself couldn't quite explain it. The machine that had tortured him just days ago was silent now. The alien guards, confused by their failure to break him, seemed to have lost some of their confidence. They walked with less authority, their steps a little more hesitant. It was as if they too sensed that something was shifting. But even in this moment of uncertainty, the prisoner remained still, his eyes watching them from the darkness of his cell. Hours passed. The guards came and went, but the prisoner didn't react. He had learned that the silence between each round of torture was just another form of battle. It was during these moments of quiet that his resolve grew, a quiet strength building within him that no machine or alien could defeat. But the stillness was short-lived. That evening, a guard entered his cell, carrying something unusual in his hand, a small metallic object. The prisoner's eyes narrowed. This was different. A strange sense of curiosity flickered within him. The guard's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made the human's pulse quicken. For a moment, the prisoner wondered if this was yet another cruel trick, another attempt to break him by offering false hope. The guard didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He stepped closer, placing the object carefully into the prisoner's hands. It was a small key, no bigger than the palm of the prisoner's hand, but it was more than just a piece of metal. It was a symbol, a chance, a lifeline. The prisoner's heart raced as he felt the cool weight of it. There was no time to question why the guard had given it to him. He didn't care about the why. He only cared about the what. The guard quickly stepped back, his eyes darting nervously as if worried someone would catch him. The human didn't waste time. His mind raced with possibilities. The key was obviously meant to unlock something. But what? The guard was leaving, and with him, any chance of answers. But the prisoner's thoughts raced faster than his fears. He had learned to observe, to watch the small details, the way the guards moved, the way they locked the doors, the way the alien systems worked. The key might be for a lock he hadn't seen before, but the pattern of the guards' movements told him it was worth trying. He had to act quickly, before they noticed the shift in their routine. The human quickly hid the key in the folds of his ragged clothing. He didn't dare use it yet. He had to wait. His body was still aching from the last round of torture, and he could feel the burn in his muscles. But there was something else too, something that had sparked deep within him when he held that key. Hope. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for. The hours stretched out as he sat motionless, his mind filled with plans, doubts, and silent questions. Was this real? Could he escape this time? He knew the aliens would soon realize that something was different, that something had shifted. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated his ability to adapt. The key was proof of that. It was an opening, a crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall the aliens had built around him. The days that followed were filled with careful observation. He studied the guards' routines, counting the moments between their patrols. He waited for any sign that the aliens had noticed a change, any sign that they had caught on to the small act of defiance that had come from one of their own. But nothing happened. Every day was a gamble. He couldn't afford to rush. The key remained hidden, safe for the moment, tucked away where no one would find it. But each passing day, as the walls of the prison felt tighter around him, the human's resolve only grew stronger. This wasn't just about escaping. It was about surviving. It was about showing them, showing the aliens, that no matter what they did, no matter how many times they tried to crush him, he would rise again. And when the time came, he would be ready. Then, on the fourth day after receiving the key, something shifted. The prisoner had been working on a plan, trying to piece together how he would use the key when the time came. But it wasn't just the routine that was changing. He had noticed a new guard, someone unfamiliar to him, entering the prison block. There was something in the way this guard looked at him, something almost sympathetic. It was a glance, a moment of hesitation, but it told him everything he needed to know. This guard wasn't like the others. He was different. The prisoner watched the new guard closely, every movement, every breath. He could tell that this guard was unsure, nervous. The key in his hand suddenly felt heavier, more important. Was this his moment? Was this his chance to finally break free? That night, when the guards changed shifts, the prisoner slipped the key from its hiding place. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping that the guard who had handed him the key would return. He knew the risks. He knew that if this failed, the consequences could be deadly. But he also knew that if he didn't act now, he might never get another chance. With the key in hand, the prisoner stood up slowly, his body groaning in protest. Every step was calculated, deliberate. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. But his mind was sharp. He was focused. The key wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a chance to escape, a chance to take back control of his life. The prisoner approached the door, and with a steady hand, he slid the key into the lock. There was a brief moment of hesitation. Would it fit? Would it work? And then, with a soft click, the lock turned. The door creaked open. For the first time in weeks, the human felt something he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Freedom. The door was open. And though the road ahead was uncertain, the prisoner knew that this was his moment. This was his chance to break free. The turning point. The cold, damp air hit the human's face like a slap as he stepped out of the cell. For a moment, he simply stood there, his body trembling from the mix of pain, adrenaline, and sheer disbelief. The door behind him was closed, but it didn't matter. The lock had given way. The key had worked. It was real. The darkness of the prison corridor stretched ahead, but it no longer felt like a cage. It was a path to freedom. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the burning realization that this was his chance. This was the turning point. Everything he had endured, every minute of torture, every drop of blood shed, had led to this moment. And now he had to make it count. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, slowly. His body was battered, aching from the constant strain of the alien's torture, but his mind was clear. He had a plan now. He had a way out. He couldn't waste this opportunity. He moved silently down the corridor, careful not to make a sound. Every footstep felt heavy, each turn of the hallway a potential risk. He knew the guards' patrols. He had memorized their movements. He knew when they would come, how long they would be gone, and where the blind spots were. The key had been the first step, but now the real challenge began. The aliens would be watching for anything out of the ordinary, and if he was caught, it was over. The weight of the key still sat heavy in his pocket, a reminder of the small act of rebellion that had set this in motion. He had no illusions. This was not a guaranteed escape, but it was something. And as long as there was something, he would fight for it. His pulse quickened as he reached the first intersection. He peered around the corner, staying low, listening. There was no movement. The guards were still on their patrols. He moved on, his feet light but purposeful. The door to the guard station was just ahead. If he could get past it, he would be out of the immediate danger zone. After that, it was just a matter of finding the exit. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the hall, a quiet scraping sound, barely noticeable, but enough to make his heart stop. His breath caught in his throat, and he froze. The sound grew louder, closer. No, not now, he thought desperately. It was a guard. A single step away from him. The human pressed himself flat against the wall, his body tensing. He had to act fast. There was no time to hide, no way to avoid being seen if the guard rounded the corner. His hand shot to the small object at his side, the key. He could hear the guard's steps getting closer, the scraping sound of boots scraping against the cold metal floor. His heart raced. He couldn't afford to be discovered. Not now. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. For a brief moment, the human was certain the guard had spotted him. His mind raced with options. Could he fight? Could he hide? But then, the scraping resumed, a little further down the hall. The guard was moving away. The human exhaled slowly, his entire body relaxing in one long, silent breath. He pressed forward, each step more determined than the last. This was it. There was no turning back now. As he neared the guard station, he crouched low, watching intently as the door came into view. Through the small crack in the wall, he could see the guards lounging inside, talking lazily. They had no idea that he was so close. The only thing standing between him and freedom was their distraction, and the key. With a deep breath, the human crept closer, inching his way toward the station door. He was close enough now to feel the cool air from inside. His fingers brushed against the metal of the key, and with a swift movement, he silently slid it into the door lock. It clicked open. He froze, the door creaking slightly as it gave way. A wave of panic surged through him, but he quickly steadied his breath. It was now or never. He eased the door open just enough to slip inside, his eyes quickly scanning the room. The guards were still occupied with their conversation, unaware of the figure slipping past them. His heart raced as he passed through the door, his back pressed against the cold, hard wall, barely a foot from the guards. The prisoner moved swiftly, carefully avoiding any noise. His mind screamed at him to hurry, but his body remained controlled. He had made it this far. He could not afford to make a mistake now. With each passing moment, the sense of urgency grew. He was close. The exit was within reach. But there was still the matter of the final guard patrol, the one that circled the outer perimeter, the one that would catch him if he was not careful. He moved forward, each step calculated. He had watched the guards for days, learned their shifts, their habits. He knew their routines better than they knew themselves. And right now, he needed that knowledge more than ever. Ahead of him was the large blast door. If he could just reach it, he would be out of the prison. He could see it in his mind's eye. The open expanse of freedom, the outside world, the stars above. But as he neared the door, something caught his eye. A slight movement from the corner of the hall. A guard. The human froze. There was no time to backtrack. He had to make a decision, and fast. In that moment of panic, a wave of clarity washed over him. He wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been broken by this place, everyone who had ever been subjected to the same torment. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. His breath steadied as he crouched down low, blending into the shadows. The guard was close now, only a few feet away. The human waited, holding his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. And then, in a heartbeat, he sprang into action. With a swift motion, he leaped from the shadows, grabbing the guard from behind, his arm locking around the alien's neck in a firm grip. The guard struggled for a moment, but the human's hands were stronger. His muscles burned from the strain, but he didn't let go. He could hear the muffled gasps of the guard, the frantic clawing at his hands. But it didn't matter. In the blink of an eye, the guard went limp. The human quickly stripped the guard of his uniform, tying him up in the same shadows that had concealed him moments earlier. There was no time to waste. The alarm would be raised soon, and if he didn't hurry, he would be caught. The blast door was right in front of him. This was the moment. He could feel the weight of everything he had endured. All the pain, the fear, the doubt, all of it was behind him now. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a fighter. With one final glance back, he turned the handle and stepped into the unknown. The final steps of freedom. The escape. The human's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped through the blast door. The cold, fresh air hit his face like a wave, and for a moment, he simply stood there, inhaling deeply, letting the sensation of freedom wash over him. The weight of the prison, the isolation, the torture, the constant threat of death was gone. He was no longer bound by the walls of the alien fortress, but he knew that this freedom was fragile. His escape was only the beginning. He could hear the sounds of distant alarms blaring in the prison complex, the shrill warning of his disappearance finally catching the attention of the guards. The chase would soon begin. His window of opportunity was closing fast. He didn't have much time before the aliens realized what had happened and initiated a full-scale search. The human's breath came in short, sharp bursts, his body still aching from the brutal treatments he had endured. But his mind was clear, focused on the only thing that mattered now: survival. The outside world was a dark, vast wasteland. The sky above was a deep, unnerving shade of purple, unlike the skies he remembered from Earth. Alien stars twinkled faintly overhead, casting a strange glow over the barren landscape. It was a world far from home, a world of unknown dangers, but it was freedom. It was his escape, and it was enough to make him feel alive once again. He glanced over his shoulder, checking the blast door to make sure it remained shut behind him. The faintest sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. There were guards out there, patrolling the perimeter, searching for any signs of movement. He couldn't afford to be seen. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but he forced himself to keep moving. The terrain was rugged and unfamiliar, filled with jagged rocks and alien plants that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His mind raced as he calculated his next steps. The prison complex was located in the heart of a desolate landscape, surrounded by a vast wilderness that stretched for miles. If he could make it through the first few miles undetected, he might have a chance of losing the guards. But the clock was ticking. The human moved swiftly, using the shadows of the craggy rocks and the twisted trees to his advantage. He had no weapons, no supplies, and no clear idea of where he was going. All he had was the fire inside him, the burning desire to escape, to survive. He had been prepared to die in that prison, but now that he had a taste of freedom, he was determined to make it count. He moved silently, his footsteps careful, light, avoiding any sound that might alert the aliens to his presence. Every few minutes, he would pause, crouching low behind rocks or trees, listening for any sign of pursuit. He could hear the distant hum of the alien vehicles in the sky, their searchlights scanning the terrain for any signs of movement. The humans had been clever enough to design stealth technology that might be able to evade their search, but it wasn't foolproof. He had to stay one step ahead, always alert, always listening. Hours passed, and the human began to feel the weight of his choices. The terrain was harder than he had anticipated, and his body was growing weaker by the minute. His muscles burned with every step, and the long journey was starting to take its toll. He had been through so much, too much, but the thought of returning to that prison, of falling back into the hands of the aliens, was something he could not bear. It wasn't just his own life on the line anymore. It was everyone who had ever been imprisoned, tortured, and abandoned. It was his chance to prove that they had underestimated humanity. He stumbled, his foot catching on a loose rock, but he quickly regained his balance. His breathing was labored, but he kept moving. There was no turning back now. He had come too far. As he pressed on, the sound of distant vehicles grew louder. The aliens were closing in. He could hear the low hum of their engines as they cut through the air above him, their searchlights sweeping across the rocky landscape. He knew they were looking for him, and he had to get away before they could pinpoint his location. His legs felt like lead, his entire body screaming in pain, but his mind remained focused. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Every step he took, every breath he drew, brought him closer to freedom. The light from the alien vehicles grew brighter, and the sounds of their engines grew nearer. Panic rose in his chest, but he pushed it down, fighting to keep his calm. He had no choice. He had to get away. Then, just as the sound of the engines seemed to be right above him, he spotted something in the distance, a small, hidden cave, tucked away beneath a cliffside. It was his only chance. The human sprinted toward it, using every ounce of strength he had left. His heart raced in his chest as he reached the entrance and slipped inside, just as the searchlights passed over the spot where he had been only moments ago. The cave was small, but it offered shelter, at least for now. The human pressed himself flat against the cold stone wall, holding his breath as he listened for the sound of the alien vehicles passing by. His pulse thudded in his ears, the tension almost unbearable as he waited. He knew that if they spotted him now, there would be no escape. The cave offered him a temporary refuge, but he couldn't stay here long. The aliens would search every inch of the terrain, and sooner or later, they would find him. But for now, he was safe. As the sound of the search vehicles faded into the distance, the human exhaled slowly. His body slumped with exhaustion, but his mind was still sharp. He had made it. He had escaped. The prison was far behind him, but the road ahead was uncertain. He didn't know what lay beyond the cave or where his journey would take him. But he had a chance, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in what felt like forever, the human allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a survivor. But as the hours passed and the silence of the cave settled around him, he realized something important. This escape wasn't just about him. It was about something much greater. He wasn't just running from the aliens. He was running for them. Every person who had been held captive, every person who had suffered under the alien rule. This escape was a message. Humanity would never be broken. And that was a message the aliens would soon learn to fear. Victory and a message of hope. The human lay in the cave, his body aching with exhaustion, but his mind was alive with a quiet, burning fire. The escape was only the beginning, a small victory in the larger battle he knew was ahead. Every part of him screamed for rest. His muscles were raw, his wounds still fresh, and his mind was filled with images of the prison that had held him captive for so long. Yet, despite the overwhelming urge to collapse, there was no time to rest. His freedom had come at a high cost, and the fight was far from over. The landscape outside was vast, endless, and alien. The stars above were strange, unfamiliar. The silence around him was broken only by the distant hum of alien technology, far off in the skies. It was a world he didn't know, a place that didn't belong to him. But it was his new reality, and he would have to navigate it if he wanted to stay free. He closed his eyes, letting his body rest for just a moment. In those quiet seconds, the thoughts of Earth crept back into his mind. The familiar smells, the warmth of the sun, the faces of loved ones. He could almost feel the breeze from his home planet, the sweet comfort of being surrounded by those he cared about. His heart ached with longing, but he also knew he couldn't afford to be distracted. He couldn't allow himself to falter, not now, not when everything was riding on his survival. As the night passed and the first rays of a foreign sun began to illuminate the sky, he slowly sat up, pushing the weight of his exhaustion aside. He had made it this far, and now he needed to act. The aliens would be searching for him, and every passing hour brought the risk of them closing in on his trail. He knew he couldn't stay in the cave for long. He had to keep moving. But what would he do next? The answer was clear. He wasn't just running to survive. He was running to send a message that would echo across the stars. Humanity wasn't a species to be underestimated. The aliens had thought they could break him, that they could make him bow to their will. But he had shown them otherwise. And now he was going to show the galaxy that the spirit of humanity could never be snuffed out. He moved silently, slipping from the cave and into the vast landscape. Every step he took was a step toward that message. Every move he made was a step toward something larger than himself. He wasn't just one man. He was the embodiment of a collective will, the will of every human who had ever been oppressed, who had ever fought against impossible odds, who had ever been denied their freedom. For hours, he trekked across the rugged terrain, the unknown wilderness stretching endlessly before him. There were no familiar landmarks, no way of knowing what dangers might lie ahead, but he pressed on. With each step, the sound of his footfalls seemed to carry the weight of all the lives he had left behind. He wasn't just escaping for himself. He was escaping for all of humanity. He was escaping for the people who would one day look to the stars and know that their time would come. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, he finally reached a high vantage point, a cliff that overlooked the alien wilderness. The view before him was breathtaking in its alien beauty, but there was no time for awe. He was here for a purpose. He had to make sure his escape wasn't in vain. His mind raced with ideas. How could he send a message? How could he make the galaxy understand that the human spirit could not be crushed? Then, as if in answer to his question, he spotted something on the horizon. An alien communication tower. It loomed like a dark sentinel against the sky, its twisting, metallic structure reaching toward the heavens. It was the perfect target. If he could reach that tower, if he could somehow use it to broadcast his message, humanity's voice would be heard. He could do what no one thought was possible, send a signal across the stars, a signal that would show the aliens just how wrong they had been. The human's heart surged with determination. This was his moment. This was what he had been waiting for. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the future of humanity. And if he could use the communication tower to broadcast a message, he would do just that. He began his trek toward the tower, every step more determined than the last. The sun beat down on him as he moved, the heat making his clothes stick to his skin. But he barely noticed. His focus was laser sharp. He had one goal now: to reach that tower, to climb its heights, and to make sure the aliens knew that humanity would never surrender. It took hours to reach the tower, each step harder than the last. His body was weary, his muscles protesting with every movement, but he kept going. When he finally reached the base of the tower, he was covered in sweat, his clothes torn from the harsh journey. But he didn't hesitate. He had come too far. The tower was massive, its twisted form towering above him. He could see the faint glow of alien energy pulsing through it, and he knew that this was his chance. With every ounce of strength left, he began to climb, his fingers finding purchase on the cold alien metal. He climbed higher, his body screaming in pain, but his mind was focused. He could almost hear the echoes of his mother's words in his head again. Never give up. The true strength of a person isn't in how much they can take, but in how much they can overcome. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached the top of the tower. The alien communication systems were complex, but the human had been trained for this. He found the control panel, hidden beneath a layer of alien technology. With shaking hands, he worked quickly, bypassing the security protocols, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion. He connected his small, makeshift transmitter to the system, preparing to send his message. And then, with a final triumphant push of a button, it was done. A burst of static filled the air, followed by a clear, unmistakable voice, the voice of the human prisoner, now free. "This is for all of us," he said, his voice calm but filled with an unwavering strength. "We are humans, and we will never bow to you. We will never be your prisoners. We are more than you can ever imagine, and we will fight." The message was short, but it carried the weight of everything he had endured. It carried the fire of every human who had ever fought, every person who had ever been held down, every soul who had ever been told they weren't strong enough. The signal echoed across the stars, a beacon of hope for those who would follow. And with that, the human turned away from the tower, his journey far from over, but his victory undeniable. The aliens might have thought they could break him, but he had proven them wrong. Humanity's fight had only just begun.